The contact lasted barely 3 seconds. 3 seconds that drained the air from the gala, stilled the glass in the hand of the man in front of her, and turned a reckless dare into a collision she couldn't escape. Alexa thought she could play with fire and walk away without a burn. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just looked down at her, his gray eyes tracing her face like he was memorizing a weakness he didn't know he had. And that was the moment Alexa's safe world shattered. 2 hours earlier, the evening had been predictable. A sea of black tuxedos, polite smiles, the heavy weight of her father's influence. Alexa was just the event planner, the billionaire's daughter hiding behind a dark green hoodie and a clipboard, invisible by choice. Then came the whisper from the staff, "Dare you to touch the man in the gray suit, the one your father said is off limits." Alexa touched Luciano's arm because she wanted to prove she wasn't afraid of her father's ghosts. But the man in the light gray suit wasn't a ghost. Luciano didn't exist in the world of corporate mergers and stock options. He was the shadow that owned the light. Alexa walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs, convinced she had won the game. Luciano watched her disappear into the crowd, his inked fingers tightening around his drink. He had spent 30 years feeling nothing. Now he felt everything, and he wasn't letting her go. The drive back to her father's estate was a blur of high-speed curves and the rhythmic thumping of Alexa's heart against her ribs. She kept her hands tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, still feeling the phantom heat on her palm where she had touched the light gray fabric of Luciano's sleeve. It had been a 3-second act of defiance, a momentary rebellion against the suffocating expectations of the gala. But as the iron gates of the Sterling Manor swung open like the jaws of a silent beast, the weight of what she had done began to settle. The Sterling estate was a monument to old money and new security. It was a sprawling fortress of glass and limestone, perched on a cliffside that overlooked the city like a king watching his subjects. Alexa parked her car and sat in the silence of the garage for a moment, pulling the hood of her dark green sweatshirt over her head. To the world, she was Alexa Sterling, the heiress to a global empire. To herself, she was just an event planner who preferred the shadows of the back of the house to the blinding lights of the ballroom. She entered through the side door, hoping to slip past the security detail and the late-night staff, but the house was unnaturally quiet. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that reminded her of the moment the music had died down at the gala when she made her move. "You're late, Alexa." The voice came from the top of the grand staircase. Her father, Julian Sterling, stood there with a glass of scotch in one hand and a phone in the other. He didn't look angry, he looked calculated. That was always worse. "The gala ran long," Alexa said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. She started toward the stairs, but her father's next words stopped her cold. "I told you to stay away from the north wing of the ballroom tonight. I told you there were people in attendance who don't play by the rules of polite society." Alexa stopped on the third step, looking up at him. "I was doing my job, Dad. If you didn't want me near them, you shouldn't have hired me to run the event." Julian descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on his daughter. "There is a difference between running an event and making yourself a target. I received a phone call 10 minutes ago. It seems you made quite an impression on a particular guest." Alexa's pulse spiked. "It was a dare, a joke among the catering staff. It didn't mean anything." "To you, perhaps," Julian said, reaching the bottom and standing before her. He was a man who moved markets with a whisper, but even he seemed shadowed by a flicker of genuine concern. To a man like Luciano, nothing is a joke. He doesn't see a dare, he sees an opening, he sees a weakness. "He didn't look like he was looking for a weakness," Alexa retorted, remembering the way Luciano's gray eyes had locked onto hers. "He looked like he was trying to remember how to breathe." Julian's jaw tightened.
Do not romanticize him. Luciano is not one of your high society bachelors looking for a trophy wife. He is the transition point for a legacy built on blood. I am in the middle of a delicate merger with his legitimate holdings, a merger that will ensure our family's dominance for the next century. I cannot have you disrupting that balance because you felt like being defiant for 3 seconds. I'm not a chess piece in your merger, Dad, Alexa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. In this house, everyone is a piece, Julian replied coldly. Go to bed, Alexa, and stay in the main house tomorrow. We have guests arriving for a private breakfast.
Alexa didn't argue. She knew when the conversation was over. She climbed the stairs, her feet heavy, and retreated to her room. But sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sharp jawline, the dark hair slicked back, and the intricate black ink that crawled up Luciano's neck, a map of a world she wasn't supposed to understand. The next morning, the estate felt different. The usual hum of the staff was replaced by a heavy, professional silence. As Alexa walked down the hallway toward the breakfast nook, she noticed men she didn't recognize standing at the perimeter of the gardens. They weren't her father's security. These men wore dark suits and carried themselves with a lethal, coiled energy. They didn't look at the cameras. They looked at the exits. She reached the dining room, intending to grab a coffee and disappear into her home office, but she froze in the doorway. Her father was seated at the head of the long mahogany table. Across from him, bathed in the morning light that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, was the man in the light gray suit. Luciano looked even more imposing in the daylight. The gray of his suit was the color of a storm cloud, and his white shirt was crisp, the top button open just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo that looked like a bird's wing. He was holding a porcelain teacup with a hand that looked like it could crush stone, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look up when she entered, but she saw the way his shoulders shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence that felt like a physical touch. "Alexa," her father said, his voice tight, "I believe you've encountered Mr. Luciano." Luciano finally raised his head. The gray eyes were just as focused as they had been the night before, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of recognition, a silent challenge. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the dare or the joke. He simply watched her. "She was the one in charge of the gala," Luciano said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the room. "She has a very hands-on approach to management." The sarcasm was so dry it was almost invisible, but Alexa felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She didn't back down. She walked into the room, her dark green hoodie a stark contrast to the formal elegance of the men, and poured herself a cup of coffee. "I find that if you want something done right, you have to be willing to touch it yourself," Alexa said, meeting Luciano's gaze over the rim of her cup. Julian's eyes darted between them, sensing a current he couldn't control. "Mr. Luciano is here to finalize the security protocols for the merger, Alexa. He will be staying on the estate for the duration of the negotiations." The coffee cup nearly slipped from her hand. "He's staying here?" "For our mutual protection," Luciano answered for her father. He stood up, his height dominating the room. He moved around the table with a predator's grace, stopping just inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and something metallic clung to him. "Your father is concerned about the elements my business attracts. I told him the safest place for everyone involved is within sight." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Including the girl who thinks she can play with fire and not get burned." Alexa looked up at him, her defiance flaring. "I've lived in this house my whole life, Mr. Luciano. I'm used to being surrounded by dangerous men. You're just the first one who wears a better suit." For the first time, a shadow of an expression crossed Luciano's face. It wasn't a smile, but the corner of his eye crinkled, a microscopic sign of intrigue. He had spent his life surrounded by people who bowed or bled. He had never met someone who looked at him like he was just another problem to be solved. "We shall see, Alexa," he said, stepping back and nodding to her father.
The merger is a complex process. Many things will change before it is finished. As Luciano walked out of the room, followed by his silent shadows, Alexa realized her father was right about one thing. The dare wasn't over. It had just moved into her own home. She was no longer just the billionaire's daughter or the invisible event planner. She was the only thing in this house that Luciano couldn't buy. And for a man who had never felt love, that made her the most dangerous thing in his world. The following week, the Sterling estate felt less like a home and more like a pressurized chamber. Alexa tried to bury herself in her work, retreating to her boutique event planning office, a glass-walled sanctuary on the second floor of the mansion's converted west wing. Here, she wasn't a daughter or a pawn. She was an architect of moments. But the silence she usually craved was gone, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic tread of Luciano's security detail in the hallway outside. She was staring at a floor plan for an upcoming charity gala, the digital pen hovering over her tablet, when the air in the room suddenly changed. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere thickens just before a summer storm. Alexa didn't look up. She didn't need to. "The office is for scheduled appointments only." Alexa's voice sounded far more certain than she felt. "I am a man who appreciates punctuality." Luciano's low, gravelly voice vibrated through the room. "But I have never been fond of waiting for an invitation." Alexa finally raised her head. Luciano stood in the doorway, framed by the sleek, modern lines of her office. He had traded the charcoal suit for another in his signature light gray, the tailored fabric stretching across his broad shoulders. The top button of his shirt was open, revealing the dark ink that climbed his throat, a stark contrast to his pristine appearance. He looked entirely too large for the room, a predator pacing a cage made of glass. "My father is in the study," Alexa said, setting her pen down. "I'm sure he's expecting you." "I am not here to talk to your father about mergers and maritime law," Luciano said, stepping into the room. He didn't wait for her to ask him to sit. Instead, he began to walk the perimeter of her office, his eyes scanning the sketches on the walls and the fabric swatches on her desk. He stopped at a mood board pinned with deep greens and gold accents. He reached out, his large tattooed hand brushing against a piece of silk. The movement was surprisingly gentle, a jarring juxtaposition to the lethality he carried in his gaze. "I am celebrating a transition," he said, turning to look at her. "A closing of one chapter and the opening of another. It requires a certain discretion and a level of bravery that most people in your industry lack." "Bravery?" Alexa challenged.
It's a party, not a battlefield. For some, there is no difference, Luciano replied. He walked toward her desk, leaning forward until he was in her space, his scent, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something cold washing over her. "I want to see if that fire I saw at the gala was real, or if it was just a side effect of too much champagne and the safety of your father's shadow." He was testing her. Alexa could see it in the way his eyes tracked the pulse in her throat. He wasn't looking for a planner. He was looking for the girl who had touched his arm and silenced a room of killers. He was looking for the flaw in her armor. "You think I did that because I felt safe?" Alexa asked, her voice dropping to a low, defiant silk. She stood up, refusing to let him tower over her. Even with her petite frame, she matched his intensity, her dark hair falling from its messy ponytail as she tilted her head back. "I did it because I was bored of the safety. I did it because everyone in that room was terrified of you, and I wanted to see if you were actually made of flesh and bone, or just the stories my father tells to keep me in line." Luciano's eyes narrowed, the gray of his pupils darkening like a churning sea. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the hum of the air conditioning. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He watched her with a focus so total it felt like she was the only person left in the world. "And what did you find, Alexa?" he whispered. "I found that you're very good at making people wait for a reaction that never comes," she said, refusing to blink. But you're also the first person in this house who has actually looked at me, and not just the sterling name." A slow, dangerous energy seemed to uncoil within him. Luciano reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her jawline. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the heat radiating from his hand was enough to make her skin prickle. "The lesson for today," he said, his voice a soft warning, "is that curiosity is a debt, and eventually the collector comes to call. If you take this job, you aren't just choosing flowers and music. You are choosing to stand beside a man who has many enemies and very few friends." "I've spent my life standing beside a billionaire," Alexa retorted. "I know how enemies work. I'm just wondering if you're man enough to let someone actually stand beside you and not 3 steps behind." Luciano's hand dropped, but he didn't pull away. A shadow of a smirk, the first she had seen, tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a kind expression. It was the look of a man who had finally found a challenge worth his time. "My office will send over the details this evening. The event will be at my private estate. No press, no sterling security, just my world." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door, looking back over his shoulder. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark, slicked-back hair that made him look like a king from a darker era. "Don't wear the hoodie, Alexa. I want to see the woman who isn't afraid of ghosts." As he disappeared down the hall, Alexa sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. Her heart was racing, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She looked down at her hands and realized they were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer electric jolt of being truly seen. Luciano hadn't come for an event planner. He had come to see if she was a fluke. And in standing her ground, she had just signed a contract for much more than a party. She had stepped out of the billionaire's shadow and directly into the Mafia boss's light. The first lesson was over, but as the sun began to set over the estate, Alexa realized the real education was only just beginning. The meeting was set for 11 p.m. at a place that felt like an affront to the sterling name, a roadside diner with a flickering neon sign and vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Alexa arrived first, still clad in her dark green oversized hoodie, the heavy cotton acting as a shield against the chilly night air and the growing realization that she was playing a game whose rules were written in a language she didn't speak. She sat in the far corner booth, the smell of grease and burnt coffee, a grounding contrast to the sterile, expensive scents of her father's estate. She was nursing a glass of water when the diner's bell chimed, a lonely, high-pitched ring that felt like a warning. Luciano stepped inside. He was a ghost in the machine, a vision of sharp edges and high-end tailoring in a room made of rounded plastic and linoleum. He wore another light gray suit, the fabric catching the yellowed light of the diner and making him look like he had been cut out of a different reality and pasted onto the background. He scanned the room with a practiced sweeping motion, his gaze lingering on the exit and the kitchen door before finally settling on Alexa. He walked toward her, his presence seemingly shrinking the room. When he slid into the booth opposite her, the table felt too small, the space between them too intimate. "You chose this place," Luciano said, his voice a low rumble that made the silverware on the table hum. "I like the coffee, and no one here cares who my father is," Alexa said, watching him. He noticed he didn't lean back. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, his tattooed hands resting flat on the table, fingers spread slightly, as if ready to grip a weapon or a throat. "You think I did that because I felt safe?" Alexa asked, her voice dropping to a low, defiant silk. She stood up, refusing to let him tower over her. Even with her petite frame, she matched his intensity, her dark hair falling from its messy ponytail as she tilted her head back. "I did it because I was bored of the safety. I did it because everyone in that room was terrified of you, and I wanted to see if you were actually made of flesh and bone, or just the stories my father tells to keep me in line." Luciano's eyes narrowed, the gray of his pupils darkening like a churning sea. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the hum of the air conditioning. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He watched her with a focus so total it felt like she was the only person left in the world. "And what did you find, Alexa?" he whispered. "I found that you're very good at making people wait for a reaction that never comes," she said, refusing to blink. "But you're also the first person in this house who has actually looked at me, and not just the sterling name." A slow, dangerous energy seemed to uncoil within him. Luciano reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her jawline. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the heat radiating from his hand was enough to make her skin prickle. "The lesson for today," he said, his voice a soft warning, "is that curiosity is a debt, and eventually the collector comes to call. If you take this job, you aren't just choosing flowers and music. You are choosing to stand beside a man who has many enemies and very few friends." "I've spent my life standing beside a billionaire," Alexa retorted. "I know how enemies work. I'm just wondering if you're man enough to let someone actually stand beside you and not 3 steps behind." Luciano's hand dropped, but he didn't pull away. A shadow of a smirk, the first she had seen, tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a kind expression. It was the look of a man who had finally found a challenge worth his time. "My office will send over the details this evening. The event will be at my private estate. No press, no sterling security, just my world." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door, looking back over his shoulder. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark, slicked-back hair that made him look like a king from a darker era. "Don't wear the hoodie, Alexa. I want to see the woman who isn't afraid of ghosts." As he disappeared down the hall, Alexa sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. Her heart was racing, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She looked down at her hands and realized they were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer electric jolt of being truly seen. Luciano hadn't come for an event planner. He had come to see if she was a fluke. And in standing her ground, she had just signed a contract for much more than a party. She had stepped out of the billionaire's shadow and directly into the Mafia boss's light. The first lesson was over, but as the sun began to set over the estate, Alexa realized the real education was only just beginning. The meeting was set for 11 p.m. at a place that felt like an affront to the sterling name. A roadside diner with a flickering neon sign and vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Alexa arrived first, still clad in her dark green oversized hoodie, the heavy cotton acting as a shield against the chilly night air, and the growing realization that she was playing a game whose rules were written in a language she didn't speak. She sat in the far corner booth, the smell of grease and burnt coffee, a grounding contrast to the sterile, expensive sense of her father's estate. She was nursing a glass of water when the diner's bell chimed, a lonely, high-pitched ring that felt like a warning. Luciano stepped inside.
He was a ghost in the machine, a vision of sharp edges and high-end tailoring in a room made of rounded plastic and linoleum. He wore another light gray suit, the fabric catching the yellowed light of the diner and making him look like he had been cut out of a different reality and pasted onto the background. He scanned the room with a practiced sweeping motion, his gaze lingering on the exit and the kitchen door, before finally settling on Alexa. He walked toward her, his presence seemingly shrinking the room. When he slid into the booth opposite her, the table felt too small, the space between them too intimate. "You chose this place," Luciano said, his voice a low rumble that made the silverware on the table hum. He didn't look disgusted, he looked confused, like a scientist observing a phenomenon that defied the laws of physics. I like the coffee, and no one here cares who my father is, Alexa said, watching him. She noticed he didn't lean back. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, his tattooed hands resting flat on the table, fingers spread slightly as if ready to grip a weapon or a throat. And I wanted to see if you could survive 20 minutes without a security detail or a 5-course meal. Luciano glanced at the laminated menu, his eyes tracing the list of breakfast specials and burger combos. I have survived much worse than a diner, Alexa, but I find the lack of structural integrity in this establishment concerning. It's called a vibe, Luciano. It's supposed to be casual. A waitress appeared, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marge. She didn't flinch at Luciano's tattoos or his lethal aura. She just tapped her pen against her notepad. "What can I get you, sugar?" "Coffee, black," Alexa said. Marge turned to Luciano. "And for the gentleman in the fancy suit?" Luciano stared at her. The silence stretched. He looked at the menu again, then at the waitress, then back at the menu. It was the first time Alexa had seen him hesitate. It wasn't the hesitation of a man who was afraid, but of a man who was profoundly out of his element. "I will have the number 4, he finally said, his pronunciation of pancakes sounding like a formal declaration of war. Once the waitress left, Alexa couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "You've never done this before, have you? Just sat down and ordered food without a protocol?" Luciano looked at her, his gray eyes unblinking. "My life has been a series of transactions. Every meal is a meeting. Every meeting is a negotiation. There is always a purpose. There is always a threat." "And tonight?" "Tonight," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "I am trying to understand why a girl who has everything would choose to spend her time in a dark green sweatshirt, hiding in a booth that smells of old fries." "I'm not hiding," Alexa said, pulling the sleeves of her hoodie over her hands. "I'm just living."
There's a difference. You should try it. A normal conversation. No mergers, no mafia, no threats. Luciano leaned in, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the diner. Define normal, Alexa. Because in my world, normal is checking the locks 3 times. Normal is knowing which of your friends would sell you out for a higher price. Normal is the weight of a holster against my ribs. Normal is talking about your favorite movie, or how you liked your coffee, or why you chose that shade of gray today, she countered. It's the small stuff, Luciano, the stuff that doesn't have a price tag. He looked at her for a long time, the intensity of his gaze making the air between them feel thick and heavy. "I chose the gray because it is the color of the city before it rains," he said quietly. "It is neutral. It is invisible in a crowd, yet distinct in a room. And I do not have a favorite movie. I do not have time for stories that aren't real." "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," Alexa whispered. The food arrived, and Luciano looked at the stack of pancakes like it was a puzzle he had to solve. He picked up his fork with a precision that was almost surgical. As he ate, Alexa found herself talking, not about the gala or the merger, but about the small things. She told him about the stray cat that lived behind her office, about the way the light hit the cliffside at dawn, and about the book she was reading. She realized, with a jolt of empathy, that he was listening with a rapt, almost desperate attention. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer a counterpoint. He just absorbed her words like a man who had been starving for a sound that wasn't a command. "You're doing it," Alexa said suddenly, interrupting her own story about a failed flower arrangement. "Doing what?" "A normal conversation. You haven't mentioned a single business rival in 10 minutes. Luciano paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked around the diner, as if noticing the chipped paint and the hum of the refrigerator for the first time. The tension in his shoulders didn't disappear, but it shifted. It went from the tension of a soldier to the tension of a man waking up from a very long sleep. "It is distracting,"
he admitted. "The way you speak. It makes the world seem smaller, less like a map of territories, and more like a place people actually inhabit." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was electric. The black ink on his knuckles was visible in the harsh diner light, the words honor and blood etched into his skin, a permanent reminder of the world he belonged to. "But you must understand, Alexa," he said, his voice losing its softness. "The reason I have never had this conversation is because men like me don't get to be normal. We get to be powerful, or we get to be dead. There is no middle ground." "Maybe you just haven't had a reason to look for one," Alexa said, her heart hammering. "And you think you are that reason?" "I think I'm the only person in your life who doesn't want anything from you but your time," she said defiantly. Luciano withdrew his hand, his eyes tracking a black SUV that had just pulled into the parking lot. The moment was over. The diner was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. The Mafia boss was back, his face hardening into the cold, focused mask she had seen at the gala. "The time is up, Alexa," he said, sliding out of the booth. He laid a $100 bill on the table for a $20 check. "My security is here. You should get back to the estate." "Luciano!" He stopped and looked down at her. For a split second, the man who had wondered about the color of the rain was there, looking at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "Thank you for the pancakes, Alexa. But don't mistake a late-night diner for a change in the weather. I am still the man your father warned you about." As he walked out into the night, his gray suit blending into the shadows of the waiting cars, Alexa sat in the booth alone. She looked at the empty seat across from her and realized that the dare wasn't just about bravery anymore. It was about a man who was experiencing his first love at 35 and a girl who was realizing that the most dangerous thing about Luciano wasn't his past, it was the heart he was finally starting to use. The drive back from the diner was the quietest 30 minutes of Alexa's life. Luciano sat beside her in the back of the armored SUV, his presence a heavy, electric weight that made the plush leather interior feel cramped. He didn't speak, but his eyes never left the side mirror, tracking the headlights of the 2 escort vehicles following them through the winding coastal roads. The normal man who had puzzled over a stack of pancakes had vanished, replaced by a commander anticipating an ambush. The scare happened just as they reached the outer perimeter of the Sterling estate. A dark sedan, lights extinguished, veered sharply across the intersection, attempting to wedge itself between Luciano's lead car and the SUV. The screech of tires tore through the night air like a scream. Alexa felt a massive tattooed hand slam against her shoulder, shoving her down onto the seat as Luciano shielded her body with his own. "Stay down," he growled, his voice no longer a rumble, but a serrated blade. The world outside became a blur of flashing strobes and muffled shouts. Luciano's security team moved with terrifying synchronized precision, forcing the intruder off the road and creating a barrier of steel. It was over in seconds, a probe, a test of his defenses, but as the SUV sped through the manor gates and came to a jarring halt at the front steps, the silence that followed was deafening. Luciano didn't move immediately. He remained draped over Alexa, his heart thundering against her back, his breath hot against her neck. When he finally pulled away, his face was a mask of cold, vibrating fury. He climbed out of the car and hauled Alexa out after him, his grip on her arm firm but not bruising. He didn't take her to her father. He marched her straight toward the West Wing, past the startled household staff, and into the quiet sanctuary of her own office. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the glass-walled room. "That,"
he said, gesturing toward the window where the distant blue lights of his security team still flickered. That is the reality you find so interesting. That is the price of the 3 seconds you took at the gala. I'm fine, Luciano. They didn't even hit us. They didn't have to hit us, he roared, pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. The light gray of his suit was rumpled, his slicked-back hair falling in dark, jagged strands over his forehead. I have spent my entire life ensuring I had nothing to lose. No family, no anchors, no one who could be used to bend my knee. And then you walk into a bar on a dare and touch my arm, and suddenly I am checking the shadows for your sake instead of my own.
Alexa looked at him, her defiance softened by the raw, terrifying honesty in his eyes. Is that what this is? You're angry because you care? Luciano let out a harsh, jagged laugh. He stepped into her space, his hands reaching out to grip the edge of the desk on either side of her, pinning her in place. Care? Alexa, I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since I met you. I find myself reading reports on floral arrangements just to see your handwriting. I sat in a grease-stained diner tonight and ate sugar-coated bread because you asked me to. I don't care. I am being dismantled by you. The admission hung in the air, heavy and fragile. For a man who had only ever known power, love wasn't a gift, it was a security breach. It was a weakness that invited death. I didn't ask you to be my bodyguard, Alexa whispered, her heart matching the frantic rhythm of his. I asked you to be a man. A man is exactly what I cannot afford to be, Luciano replied, his voice dropping to a low, pained silk. He reached out, his thumb finally brushing the line of her jaw. The touch was hesitant, as if he expected her to shatter under the weight of his history. If they know you are my peace, they will turn you into my war. My world doesn't allow for things that are precious. It only allows for things that are useful. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and Alexa saw the transformation. The lethal focus of the Mafia boss flickered, replaced by the haunting clarity of a man who had found his first and only light in a lifetime of darkness. He realized, in the quiet of that office, that he was no longer transitioning his business for the sake of his legacy or his father's merger. He was doing it because the thought of a world where Alexa had to hide in a dark green hoodie forever was intolerable. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. It was a gesture of surrender, a silent vow whispered into the space between them. I will finish this, Luciano promised, his voice vibrating with a new, terrifying resolve. I will burn every bridge that leads back to the man I was. I will build a wall so high around you that the shadows won't even know your name. I don't want a wall, Luciano, Alexa said, her hands finding the lapels of his gray suit. I want you. You have me, he whispered, his lips grazing hers in a touch that was barely a contact, but felt like a soul-deep brand. That is the problem. You have the heart of a man who has forgotten how to show mercy to anyone who threatens his own. In that moment, the first love ever wasn't a romantic cliché, it was a battle cry. Luciano pulled back, his face hardening once more into the disciplined mask of a leader, but his eyes remained anchored to hers. He turned and walked to the door, stopping only to look back at the girl in the oversized sweatshirt who had managed to do what an army of rivals never could. Stay in the house tomorrow, he commanded, but the edge was gone, replaced with a protective warmth. I have a merger to accelerate and a world to dismantle. As the door closed, Alexa sat in the silence, the scent of his sandalwood and the lingering heat of his vow filling the room. She realized then that she wasn't just an observer in Luciano's transition anymore. She was the reason for it. The dare was long over, and the stakes had shifted from a 3-second kiss to a lifetime of survival. Luciano had made his vow, not to the Mafia and not to her father, but to her. And she knew with a chilling certainty that he would destroy everything he had ever built just to keep her safe in the light. The following morning, the Sterling estate felt less like a sanctuary and more like a courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive tobacco, a sure sign that Julian Sterling had spent the night brooding.
Alexa had barely made it to the breakfast room when she saw her father standing by the window, his back to her, watching the security rotation on the lawn. "Sit down, Alexa," he said without turning. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration, the tone he used right before he dismantled a competitor's board of directors. Alexa sat, her fingers tracing the hem of her dark green hoodie. "If this is about the security scare last night, Luciano explained." "Luciano explained nothing," Julian snapped, turning around. His face was a mask of cold fury. "My security team explained. They explained how a man who is supposed to be a business associate treated you with a familiarity that suggests my warnings were entirely ignored." "He saved my life, Dad." Alexa rose, her voice rising. "The people who targeted that car weren't looking for me. They were looking for him. He took the brunt of it to make sure I wasn't even touched." "Because you are his leverage now." Julian slammed his hand onto the mahogany table, making the silver service rattle. "Do you think I'm blind? I've watched the way he looks at you. I've watched the way you look at him. You are playing a game with a man who doesn't know how to lose, Alexa. And in his world, when people like him want something, they destroy everything around it to possess it." "He's not trying to possess me," Alexa countered, standing her ground. "He's trying to change. He's moving his assets. He's trying to get out for real this time." Julian let out a harsh, cynical laugh. "Get out? Men like Luciano don't get out. They just change the color of their suits. He is using this merger, and he is using you to buy a legitimacy he hasn't earned. And I will not have the sterling name used as a laundering service for a Mafia kingpin's conscience." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "I've already made the calls. If he doesn't leave this estate by noon, I will pull every cent of funding from the merger. I will leak his shipping manifests to the federal authorities. I will bury him so deep in litigation and scandal that he won't have the time to look at you as long as protect you. I will ruin him, Alexa. I will strip him of everything he has built until he's just another thug in a gray suit." "You'd destroy your own merger? Your own legacy?" Alexa whispered, horrified. "To save my daughter from a man like that? In a heartbeat," Julian said coldly. Alexa didn't wait to hear more. She ran from the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't head for her office. She headed for the guest wing, ignoring the protests of her father's guards. She burst through the double doors of the suite Luciano had been occupying, expecting to find him preparing for a battle. Instead, she found him at a small desk surrounded by stacks of legal documents and 3 separate laptops. He didn't have a weapon out. He was wearing his light gray suit jacket, but his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the intricate black ink that told the story of his past. He looked up as she entered, his gray eyes immediately scanning her face for signs of distress.
"Your father has a very loud voice, Alexa," Luciano said calmly, though the edge of his jaw was tight. "I heard him from the hallway." "He's serious, Luciano," she panted, clutching the doorframe. "He's going to ruin you. He's going to leak everything. He says he'll burn the merger to the ground just to keep you away from me." Luciano stood up slowly, the movement fluid and predatory. He walked toward her, stopping just close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his chest. He didn't look like a man who was about to be ruined. He looked like a man who had already made a decision. "He is a billionaire," Luciano said softly, his voice a low silk. "He thinks wealth is the ultimate shield. He doesn't realize that I have been dismantling my own empire for weeks. The manifests he wants to leak, they belong to companies I've already sold. The thugs he wants to expose, they've been given their severance and sent across the border." Alexa blinked, her breath hitching. "You're already doing it? Without the merger?" "The merger was a convenience," Luciano said, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of her dark hair behind her ear. His touch was steady, a stark contrast to the chaos downstairs. "I wanted a clean transition, yes, but I don't need your father's permission to be the man you deserve. I have spent the last 72 hours ensuring that even if he burns every bridge I own, I will still be standing on the other side, with you. But your power, your standing. Power is a weight, Alexa. I have carried it since I was a boy. It is cold and it is lonely. He stepped even closer, his forehead resting against hers, a repeat of the silent vow from the night before. I would rather be a man with nothing, standing in a diner with you, than a king in a world where I have to hide you in the shadows. He'll still try to stop us, she whispered. Let him try, Luciano growled, the Mafia boss flickering behind his eyes for a brief, lethal second. He understands the power of money. He doesn't understand the power of a man who has found his first and only reason to be good. I am not leaving this house because he ordered it. I am leaving because I am finished with his world and mine. He pulled back, looking down at her with an intensity that made the room feel small. Go to your office, pack what you need for the day. We are going to his board meeting this afternoon, and we are going to show him that the Sterling name isn't the only thing that can't be broken. You're going to face him? I am going to end his leverage, Luciano said. He reached down and gripped her hand, his inked fingers locking with hers. And then, I am going to take you to lunch, somewhere with very normal sandwiches. Alexa felt a surge of hope, so strong it was almost painful. For the first time, the collision of their worlds didn't feel like a disaster. It felt like a clearing of the air. Her father thought he was protecting her from a monster, not realizing that the monster had already surrendered his teeth for the sake of her smile. As they walked out of the suite together, the gray suit and the green hoodie side by side, Alexa knew the transition was no longer a plan, it was a revolution. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the fallout. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long amber shadows across the estate's private library. It was the only room Julian Sterling rarely entered, a place filled with first editions and the scent of aging paper. Alexa sat on the velvet window seat, her knees pulled to her chest, the dark green fabric of her hoodie making her look small against the towering oak shelves. Luciano stood by the mahogany desk, but he wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at his own hands. The tension from the morning's confrontation with her father still hung in the air, a low-frequency hum that refused to dissipate. Alexa watched him, the way the light caught the silver of his suit and the dark, intricate patterns that emerged from beneath his cuffs. My father called them thug markings, Alexa said, quietly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. But they don't look like symbols of a gang. They look like a diary. Luciano stilled. He slowly set down the crystal decanter he had been reaching for and turned toward her. He didn't deflect with a cold remark or a businesslike dismissal. Instead, he began to unbutton his cuffs. He moved with a heavy deliberation, rolling the light gray sleeves up past his elbows, exposing the full extent of the ink that mapped his forearms. In my world, choice is a luxury reserved for the dead, Luciano said, his voice a low, raspy velvet. He walked toward her, stopping just at the edge of the window's light. He held out his right arm. This, he said, pointing to a series of geometric lines that looked like a shattered cage near his wrist, was 16, my father's debt. I didn't want the life, but the debt was inherited. I took the mark so my sister wouldn't have to. Alexa reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch above the ink. And this one? She asked, pointing to a crown of thorns wrapped around a fading anchor on his bicep. 19, Luciano replied, his gaze distant. The first time I had to take a life to save my own. The anchor is for the weight of it. The thorns are to remind me that every step forward in that world is a step deeper into the brush. He stepped on the edge of the window seat. The proximity forced Alexa to lower her legs.
For the first time, the Mafia boss wasn't a title or a threat. He was a man built of scars and ink. He showed her the marks of betrayals survived, the dates of fallen friends etched in small Roman numerals near his pulse point, and the complex, sweeping raven on his shoulder, the symbol of a man who was always watching the horizon for a predator. Every piece of ink on my body was earned through a lack of options, Luciano whispered, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. They weren't cold anymore. They were weary. And now? Alex asked, her heart aching for the boy who had been forced to become a monster. Luciano reached out, taking her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip steady, but she could feel the slight tremor of a man revealing his greatest vulnerability. He turned her hand over, tracing her palm with his thumb. "There is a space here," he said, gesturing to the bare skin on the inside of his left wrist, just above the pulse. "I left it clear for years. I told myself it was for the day I finally died, a place for a final mark. But when you touched my arm at the gala, when you looked at me without fear and without that sterling pity, I realized I didn't want it to be a mark of an end." "What do you want it to be?" Luciano leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the scent of sandalwood and old books surrounding them. "I want it to stay clear. I want a piece of me that hasn't been bought, or forced, or stained by the life I lived. I want it to be the part of me that belongs to you, to the man who eats pancakes in a diner and wonders about the color of the rain."
Alexa felt a tear slip down her cheek. She reached up, her fingers tracing the jawline that was usually so rigid, so guarded. "You aren't your tattoos, Luciano. You aren't the things they forced you to do." "I am the sum of my choices, Alexa," he corrected softly. "And for the first time in 35 years, I am making one that isn't about survival. I am choosing the billionaire's daughter who wears a green hoodie and sees through the suit." He pulled back just enough to look at her, a crack finally appearing in the armor he had worn since he was 16. The lethal, disciplined Mafia boss was still there, but he was no longer the one in control. The man who had found his first love ever was the one holding her hand, his thumb still tracing her pulse as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the light. "My father thinks he can ruin you by taking your money and your name," Alexis said, her voice growing stronger. "He doesn't realize he's just stripping away the things you already wanted to get rid of." "He is doing me a favor," Luciano agreed, a small, genuine ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He is clearing the board. But there is one thing he will try to do that I cannot allow. He will try to make you choose between his world and mine." "There is no choice," Alexis said firmly. "His world is a cage with better curtains. Yours is a transition, and I want to be there for the end of the story." Luciano leaned down, his lips finally meeting hers in a kiss that wasn't a dare, wasn't a joke, and wasn't a mistake. It was a slow, deep sealing of a pact. It tasted of sandalwood and desperate hope. In that library, surrounded by the history of other people's stories, Luciano and Alexa began writing the final chapter of his old life. The crack in the armor was no longer a weakness, it was the only way the light could get in. As the sun finally set, leaving the room in a soft blue twilight, Luciano rolled his sleeves back down and buttoned his cuffs. The ink was hidden once more, but the man underneath was forever changed. He stood up, offering his hand to Alexa. "Come," he said, his voice regaining its command, but with a new, protective warmth. "The board meeting starts in an hour. It's time to show your father what happens when a man has nothing left to lose and everything to win." The transition was supposed to be quiet, a clean break hidden behind the sterile paperwork of corporate mergers. But in Luciano's world, blood had a way of staining even the most expensive linen. The morning of the board meeting, Alexa decided to handle one last detail for the transition gala, a floral delivery at a boutique warehouse downtown. She didn't tell Luciano. She didn't want to see that flicker of worry in his gray eyes again, that shadow that suggested she was a liability rather than a partner. She took one of her father's security cars, thinking the Sterling name was enough of a shield. She was wrong. The trap was sprung with surgical precision. As she stepped out of the warehouse, a delivery van swerved to block her path, and 3 men in tactical gear emerged before her driver could even reach for his holster. There was no shouting, no cinematic struggle, just the cold, metallic click of a zip tie and the suffocating darkness of a hood pulled over her head. When the hood was finally removed, Alexa found herself in a space that smelled of damp concrete and motor oil, a stark contrast to the marble halls of the Sterling estate. She was seated in a rusted chair, her hands bound behind her. Standing in front of her wasn't a business associate in a gray suit, but a man named Moretti, the head of a rival family that Luciano had spent years keeping at bay. "You're a very expensive distraction, Miss Sterling," Moretti said, pacing the perimeter of the room. "Luciano thinks he can walk away from us. He thinks he can take his billions and his secrets and play house with a billionaire's daughter. He forgot that in this city, you only leave when we say you're finished." Alexa didn't scream. She didn't beg. She looked at him with the same defiance she had shown Luciano at the bar. "He already left. You're just chasing a ghost." "Then let's see if the ghost still has teeth," Moretti sneered, holding up a burner phone. 30 miles away, in the middle of the high-stakes board meeting, Luciano's phone vibrated once. He didn't look at it until the second vibration, a specific, rhythmic pulse he had set for Alexa's location tracker. He pulled the phone from the pocket of his light gray suit. The screen didn't show a text, it showed a photo of Alexa, her dark hair disheveled, her green hoodie torn at the shoulder, sitting in a chair that looked like a throne of wreckage. The room went cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the aura Luciano projected. Julian Sterling, mid-sentence about stock valuations, stopped talking. The board members shifted in their seats, suddenly feeling like they were trapped in a room with an apex predator. Luciano stood up slowly. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked at the air in front of him, his gray eyes turning into chips of flint. "The meeting is over," Luciano said. His voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It was a death knell. "Now see here, Luciano," Julian started, but the words died in his throat. Luciano walked towards the door, unbuttoning the cuffs of his gray suit. As he reached the hallway, his lead security officer, a man who had been with him since the Honor and Blood days, stepped forward. "Sir?" "Get the cars, get the heavy kit," Luciano commanded. He didn't sound like a man transitioning to a legitimate life. He sounded like the man who built an empire on the very things he was trying to leave behind. The warehouse door didn't just open, it was erased. The sound of the breaching charge echoed through the concrete space like a thunderclap. Alexa winced, her eyes straining against the sudden influx of light. Through the smoke and the chaos, she saw him. Luciano didn't look like the man who ate pancakes in a diner. He was a vision of focused, terrifying lethality. His gray suit jacket was gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the black ink of his history. He moved through the room with a grace that was entirely predatory, a weapon in each hand, his face a mask of such absolute fury that even Moretti's ran hesitated. He didn't shout commands, he didn't need to. His team moved like an extension of his own will, neutralizing the threat with a grim, silent efficiency. Luciano reached Alexa in seconds. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands, the ones that had so gently traced her palm in the library, now stained of the dust of the breach. "Did they touch you?" he whispered, his voice a jagged, raw thing. "I'm okay, Luciano," Alexa gasped, her voice trembling as the adrenaline finally crashed. "I'm okay."
He sliced through her restraints with a flick of a blade. As her hands came free, she didn't pull away. She grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him close. Luciano wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic, violent rhythm of his heart against her chest. Moretti was slumped in the corner, disarmed and surrounded by Luciano's men. He looked up, coughing through the dust. "You can't go back now, Luciano. You just reminded everyone who you really are. You're one of us." Luciano stood up, shielding Alexa behind his broad shoulders. He looked down at Moretti, and for a second, the light gray suit seemed like an illusion. The man standing there was the Mafia boss, the one who never had a choice. "You're wrong," Luciano said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "I did this for the only thing in the world that matters to me. And that's why you lose. Because you think power is something you hold. I know power is something you give up to keep what you love." He turned back to Alexa, the lethal light in his eyes softening as he looked at her dark hair and her defiant, tear-streaked face. He picked her up, her green hoodie a splash of color against his white shirt, and carried her out of the darkness. "It's over, Alexa," he whispered into her hair as they reached the fresh air. "I went back into the dark one last time to make sure they never follow us again. The debt is paid, every bit of it." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Alexa realized that the trap hadn't broken Luciano. It had finished him. It had forced him to use his old self to protect his new one. He wasn't a mafia boss anymore, and he wasn't just a billionaire's associate. He was a man who had finally made his final choice. And as he held her in the morning light, Alexa knew that the first love ever had survived its greatest test. The transition was no longer a plan, it was a reality forged in fire. The aftermath of the warehouse breach didn't result in a retreat to the shadows. Instead, it triggered an explosion of light. Luciano understood that as long as he remained a ghost in the machinery of the underworld, Alexa would always be a target for those trying to haunt him. To protect the billionaire's daughter, the mafia boss had to do the one thing his predecessors had feared most. He had to become visible. The Great Transition took place 48 hours later in the neutral territory of a high-rise glass boardroom overlooking the harbor. This wasn't a meeting of corporate boards or legal advisors, but a gathering of the city's most dangerous shadows, the heads of the remaining families, men who dealt in silence and fear. Luciano stood at the head of the table, his light gray suit pristine, his dark hair slicked back with a precision that bordered on lethal. He looked every bit the king, but the documents spread before him were his abdication papers. "I am not here to negotiate territories," Luciano said, his voice a low, steady resonance that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the windows. He didn't sit. He stood with his inked hands resting flat on the table, the word honor visible on his knuckles. "I am here to announce a dissolution. As of this moment, the Russo name is removed from all joint ventures. The docks, the private security firms, the high-interest holdings, they are being surrendered." A heavy, stunned silence followed. Moretti, his arm in a sling from the encounter at the warehouse, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "You're giving it all up? For a girl and a legitimate merger? You'll be a man without an army, Luciano. You'll be vulnerable." "I am giving you the assets to ensure that my vulnerability is none of your business," Luciano countered, his gray eyes turning to chips of ice. "The dark assets, the offshore accounts and the untraceable ledgers have been divided equally among you. Consider it a retirement tax, but it comes with a single unbreakable condition." He paused, and the air in the room seemed to tighten. "If a single shadow falls on Alexis Sterling, if a single one of your men even breathes the same air as her, the evidence I've spent 10 years gathering on every man in this room goes to the federal prosecutor. I have built a vault that opens only if I or she stops breathing. Do I make myself clear?" It was a brilliant, terrifying gambit. He wasn't just leaving, he was turning his rivals into his unwilling bodyguards. By handing over his wealth, he removed the incentive to kill him. By holding the evidence over their heads, he removed the possibility. He was dismantling his empire to build a fortress of leverage around the woman he loved.
While Luciano was severing his ties to the dark, Alexa was busy severing hers to the gilded cage of her father's expectations. She stood in Julian Sterling's study, her dark green hoodie replaced by a sharp, professional blazer, though her dark hair was still tied in her signature messy ponytail. "He's doing it, Dad." She placed a folder on his desk. "He's out. He's transferred every questionable asset. He's a civilian now. A very wealthy, very dangerous civilian, but a civilian nonetheless." Julian looked at the papers, then up at his daughter. The fury from the previous days had faded into a weary sort of respect. "He stripped himself of his own protection for you. He's either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. He's a man who found something worth more than power, and I'm not asking for your permission anymore. The merger can go through on its own merits, or you can cancel it, but Luciano and I are moving forward." Julian looked out the window at the estate he had spent a lifetime securing. He realized then that Alexa hadn't just been brave during the dare, she had inherited his own iron will. "The merger stands, if only because I'd rather have that man as an ally than an enemy with nothing left to lose." That evening the estate felt different. The heavy tread of guards was still there, but the tension had shifted from the threat of war to the quietude of a truce. Alexa found Luciano on the balcony of the West Wing, his gray suit jacket draped over a chair. He was looking out at the ocean, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, the ink on his arms catching the moonlight. He looked exhausted, but for the first time since she had met him, the rigid line of his shoulders had softened. The Mafia boss was a ghost now, a skin he had shed to reveal the man underneath. "Is it done?" asked Alexa as she stepped up beside him. Luciano turned, and the warmth that flooded his gray eyes was enough to take her breath away. "The debts are paid, Alexa. The books are closed. I am a man of legitimate holdings and very few secrets." "And the rival families?" "They are too busy counting their new money to worry about a man who is retired to the coast," he said, reaching out to take her hand. He pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I spent 15 years building a cage, thinking it was a throne. It took a 3-second dare from a girl in a green hoodie to show me where the door was." "I told you curiosity was dangerous," Alexa teased, though she leaned into his strength, feeling the steady, peaceful rhythm of his heart. "It was the most productive danger of my life," Luciano whispered.
The Great Transition was more than just a transfer of property or a legal maneuver. It was the moment Luciano Russo truly became the master of his own fate. He had publicly walked away from the only world he had ever known, handing over his dark legacy to buy a future in the light. He was no longer the man her father warned her about. He was the man who had burned his own world down just to make sure she never had to smell the smoke. As they stood together in the quiet of the night, Alexa realized that the first love ever wasn't just a feeling, it was a transformational force. It had turned a predator into a protector, and a billionaire's daughter into a woman who had found her own power. The transition was complete, and as the stars reflected in the calm waters below, the shadows finally felt like they belonged to the past. They were no longer waiting for the next hit or the next betrayal. They were just two people standing on the edge of a new life, finally allowed to breathe. 6 months after the lights had dimmed on the old world, the city felt different to Alexa. The air was clearer, no longer thick with the static of constant surveillance or the heavy scent of unspoken threats. She stood on the balcony of the new penthouse, a space of glass and warm wood that overlooked the harbor, wearing her favorite dark green hoodie. It was a relic now, a soft piece of the past she kept even as her life had become something polished and bright. Inside, the sound of a fountain pen scratching against high-grade paper stopped. Luciano stepped through the sliding glass doors, his presence still as commanding as it had been at the gala, though the edges had softened. He wore a light gray suit, tailored to perfection, but his collar was open and his sleeves were rolled up. The ink on his arms, once a map of his chains, now looked like nothing more than history, a story he had finished reading.
Luciano had spent the last half-year building a legitimate logistics empire, using his formidable discipline to move cargo that didn't require midnight docks or silenced weapons. He was a man of boardrooms and balance sheets now, a respected figure whose name no longer inspired whispers of fear, but of quiet reverence. "The gala plans are finished," Alexis said, turning to him as he leaned against the railing. "The charity is going to raise more tonight than my father's firm did in 3 years. I think I'm finally getting the hang of being legitimate." Luciano watched her, his gray eyes warm and steady. Gone was the cold, unblinking focus that had once terrified the room. In its place was a look of profound, settled peace. "You were always legitimate, Alexa. You were the only real thing in a world made of shadows." He walked toward her, the rhythmic tread of his shoes echoing on the stone. He didn't check the perimeter, he didn't look at the entrance, he only looked at her. He stopped just inches away, the scent of sandalwood and sea air surrounding them. "I spent 35 years convinced that love was a story told by people who didn't understand how the world worked. I thought my life was a series of survival. I thought my ink was my final word." He reached out, taking her hand in his. He turned it over, tracing the palm he had once described as his only clear space. "But then you walked up to me in a room full of killers and touched my arm. You didn't ask for permission, you didn't look for a reason, you just dared." He let out a soft, jagged breath that was almost a laugh. "It was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced, not because I thought you would hurt me, but because I knew the moment our eyes met that you were going to change everything I thought I knew about myself." Alexa reached up, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw. "You were already changing, Luciano. I just gave you a reason to stop fighting it." "No," he corrected gently. "You gave me a reason to fight for something else. You were the first person brave enough to see the man behind the suit, the one who was still waiting to have a quote-unquote normal conversation. You were the only one brave enough to dare to love a man who didn't even know how to love himself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to perform for a crowd or follow a protocol. He simply stood before her, man to woman, his heart finally as visible as the ink on his skin. He opened the box to reveal a ring, a flawless diamond set in a band of brushed platinum. It was simple, elegant, and strong. "Alexis Sterling," he said, his voice certain and full of a light he had never known before. "You were my first love, my only love. I don't want a future where I have to check the locks alone. I want a life where the only thing I'm transitioning toward is the next day with you. Will you keep choosing me?" Tears blurred Alexa's vision as she looked from the ring to the man who had burned down an empire just to stand beside her in the light. The dare that had started it all felt like a lifetime ago, a 3-second mistake that had turned into the only truth she ever wanted to hold on to. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Obviously, yes." Luciano slid the ring onto her finger, his hand steady and warm. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, protective tenderness. For a long moment they stayed like that, two people who had survived the collision of their worlds to find a new one. "I still have the hoodie," Alexa murmured against his chest, her hands clutching the light gray fabric of his jacket. "And I still have the suit," Luciano replied, kissing the top of her dark hair. "But I think we can finally stop wearing them as armor." As the sun set over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep violet, the billionaire's daughter and the man who used to be a king of shadows stood together. The transition was complete. The past was a closed book, and the future was a blank page. Luciano looked out at the city, no longer a map of territories to be conquered, but a home to be lived in.
He had spent his life waiting for an end he could control, but Alexa had given him a beginning he could cherish. The dare was over, and the life had finally begun. It was his first love, his last love, and the only thing in his long, storied life that had ever truly been his own.
Hey family, thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shout-outs and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.